everybody had a good night's rest. Yesterday was an exciting day, and I know we got a heck of an agenda again today, and we're going to kick it off this morning with a couple of breakout groups. So my name's Randy Grauberger. I'm with Quandl Consultants. I've been with Charlie Quandl and his team for about a year and a half now, after serving for 2 years as the project director for the Southwest Chief and Front Range Passenger Rail Commission in Colorado. We got that project off and running, and now, as Phil Rico told you yesterday, the mayor of Trinidad, that project has evolved into a Front Range Passenger Rail District. With the board has the authority to go to the ballot and seek the state funding to match federal funds for Front Range Passenger Rail service between Pueblo and Fort Collins. This morning we've got a pretty good list of folks that have already spoken to you. Dan Bilka is here with Colarail and All Aboard Northwest. Mike Christensen from Utah is with us, and we've also got Scott Rogers. I think Scott's going to be online this morning virtually, but this group is going to basically try to talk about some of the aspirational passenger rail opportunities that exist in the western part of the country, and get some out-of-the-box thinking, start to create a list of projects that certainly aren't as far along as some others, but once we get the projects that are underway in the pipeline, we're going to need some others to start to fill up that new pipeline. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dan. I think we've got about 45 minutes for this effort again this morning before we take our 10-minute break and move on into session number 6. Dan?
Hello everyone, I'm Dan Bilka. I'm president and co-founder of All Aboard Northwest, a new regional advocacy organization that goes for the Greater Northwest region. The Greater Northwest region is loosely defined as the Great Lakes to the Pacific Northwest, I-70 corridor to Canada, that people actually live out in this region. So what is it that we can do more effectively and efficiently over state lines and be able to build up the full regional and national passenger rail and transportation networks we all need? Also, I'll ask our two other panelists to introduce themselves. Scott, do you want to go?
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Dan. And we've not met in person, but it's good to meet you this way, and we've talked by phone before. I hope everybody can hear me fine. Do you want me to just introduce myself, or do you want me to make some remarks as well?
Introduce yourself, where you're from, and what's your focus?
Sure. My name is Scott Rogers. I'm actually joining you from Eau Claire, Wisconsin, so I appreciate being able to participate remotely. I am the Vice President, Governmental Affairs of the Eau Claire Area Chamber of Commerce. Here in Eau Claire, we're about 90 miles east of St. Paul. I also serve as the chair of the West Central Wisconsin Rail Coalition, which is a nonprofit organization advocating for passenger rail service in the West Central Wisconsin region of our state. And then I also am Wisconsin's appointed private sector representative on the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission, which is the 8-state Upper Midwest commission that works on coordinating among states and the expansion of passenger rail service. So in the Northwest region, not only is Wisconsin, but Minnesota and North Dakota are active members of that commission. So my focus is both locally to get passenger rail service to our line, which many years ago was the Chicago and Northwestern's 400 line, and also being part of MIPRC to see expansion of passenger rail service to other cities in Wisconsin, and along with our state rail plan, as well as seeing expansion in the upper Midwest.
Great, thank you. And up next we have my fellow board member with the National Rail Passengers Association that he and I both serve on the national board together, Mike Christensen.
Thanks, Dan. Yes, I'm Mike Christensen. I'm the executive director of the Utah Rail Passengers Association.
Okay. Could we bring up the slides, please? Okay. And again, like I said, that I'm Dan Bilka with the All Aboard Northwest. I originally grew up in South Dakota, which has a distinction of being the only state that has never had Amtrak service in the 51-year history. And I'll bring up the narrative. It's not for the lack of need or viability, but because of the lack of the historical narrative of how we got to today. And that's why I want to really break out of all our individual silos about individual limited projects, about a route, a scope, but how do they fit the part-to-whole relationship? How does the full network effect happen? How does the full network facilitate people in commerce to travel where they need to go? And that ultimately, what is a holistic transportation network? It needs to go beyond the pioneer North Coast routes. It's time for a holistic passenger rail network in the greater Northwest region. And should not be defined simply as future potential routes, but as a holistic needed vision for the greater Northwest region if we want to see the political and economic traction to build up the system we want to see. We can't just sort of be clunking along individually, just one segment after one segment that doesn't really garner the traction we need. And that services and routes in our region are not a zero-sum prospect, but really build up to the full national network we need, whether it be long-distance passenger rail, whether it be state-supported passenger rail, commuter systems, transit operations, highways, aviation, and so on. And that the long-term political momentum may require leaning on a few harder lists early to build up the political consensus to not only maintain the system we have today, which is at the other breakout session right now, really maintaining and enhancing the existing services. They should not be on basically starvation wages, limitations of equipment, but really building up the consensus to go above and beyond just individual siloed mindsets. To take a little bit of a walk back in history about how we have the national passenger rail system we have today, this is a system as it was in 1962 in the United States, with all the individual railroads, Holst railroads of that day, running their own individual services, which may or may not be coordinated there. But as you can see, it was a very robust system at that time. Up to 1967, that we had lost quite a number of routes at that point already, and even before the last slide, that we had lost a number of routes since World War II, and really being able to, we were starting to lose connections, especially in the greater Northwest region, but people lived out there then as they live out here today. This is in December 1970, right before Amtrak took over in May of '71, and you can see on how much the system had been decimated at that point, and that is what was the impetus to be able to create Amtrak as the national passenger rail provider to really build up this and safeguard the system instead of losing it entirely. And do note with a couple of the routes that are noted at running less than daily service. And same to 1975, where you see the North Coast Hiawatha that comes through Billings here, running less than daily service, which is really less than ideal for a lot of people. To 1993, where our North Coast route was lost, and we have the Pioneer route running less than daily service. And see what that goes into today. We had lost both of them. So this is a system as it stands today, which is largely based on the historical narrative of how the system was redacted under the previous railroads, and then the system as it was handed over to Amtrak in 1971. That leads us to this map that I'm sure that a lot of you are are aware of, which is the Amtrak Connects Us map from last spring. Well, though I don't know if you realize it, there's this big old hole in the greater Northwest region, but people actually live out here too. And we're saying it's high time that we get on the map with more and better passenger rail and transit operations in our region. And that today, in August 2022, we have an unprecedented opportunity before us to really see materialized results, especially in our region where previous efforts have sort of fallen flat. And that key reminder is that there is nothing in federal law that prohibits expansion of the long-distance passenger rail network. Unfortunately, this has been a common misconception by certain other parties, saying that the national network is limited at a certain amount, but that is defined as the floor, the minimum, so that we can't do the results of the past about really reducing the national network. Oh, we have to sacrifice the Pioneer route to save the Zephyr. We had to sacrifice the North Coast route in order to save the Empire Builder. It's not an either or prospect, it's a yes and. And that key among them with our opportunities in the region is the Section 222.14 studies that directs the FRA, as we heard yesterday, to look at restoring the routes previously operated by Amtrak. But key among that language, as they brought up, is the ability to look at potential new long-distance routes with specific but not sole attention to the routes in service in April 1971, right before Amtrak took over. And that can mean a lot for our region here, that we're a massive void, and even before Amtrak, we lost a lot of key connections that really are valuable and really would be vastly beneficial both for our region and communities and the national network at large. And how do we get traction to actually get action to be able to see these services instead of just doing a never-ending round of studies on studies on studies that just sit on a shelf for 10 years and we freshen up every 10, 15 years? Is we need to have regional inclusion and equity if we want to be able to see actual materialized results. People understand there's different things with phasing, but we need to be proactive with inclusion and giving voice to them, that they are our fellow citizens too, and their communities need to be connected in the national system in some way, and not just sort of an afterthought, a little thought of later on, wink, wink down the road. Then we can be able to include you maybe if there's money available. That we need to be proactive with inclusion and really build up the political consensus to be able to see stuff through. And we can work on multiple visions, multiple projects, and multiple types of services simultaneously. Again, as we brought up with the relationship with the wholesale railroads and the freight railroads, that we can work constructively with them, that we understand that they have a business to run. We're not looking at impeding their operations or putting any undue hardship on them, but we're able to really see both aspects of this coin simultaneously and build up for the system as we need. And that can go on multiple types of services as well, whether they be long distance, interstate, interregional routes, whether they be state-supported routes, whether they be commuter operations and transit operations or localized commuter services, that they all can build and add up together to really elevate the cost to do these various constituent projects there from a low simmer to a rolling boil. We can make too compelling of a case to be able to go through and do the project properly now. And vision criteria, as we were trying to lay through or really think about what is or what really could be a full intercity passenger rail network in our region, is really looking at what are the opportunities. How do we build regional equity and accessibility for people all throughout our region and facilitate the travel course that people think about and people need to go to. It's connecting certain major population centers throughout the state and additional communities of any size, spaced out in a comprehensive way that it is close enough to be accessible to people. And really focus on utilizing existing rail infrastructure and working cooperatively with the host railroads and find win-win opportunities, but also to not unduly limit ourselves if there are a few select areas that we do need to have greenfield rights-of-way or preserve the corridor for the future. Since out here, not that anything is particularly cheap, but out here in ranch land, that land might be slightly cheaper than elsewhere. And with the continuing population growth that we see in our region and elsewhere, we're able to safeguard, or we really should safeguard, the rights-of-way into the future rather than building on them and twiddling our thumbs for 30 years and then the price balloons exponentially, as we're seeing with certain other key valuable projects throughout the nation, but that they kind of miss the opportunity to be ahead of the game on it. And then again, making a compelling case, not just looking for passenger rail connections, but where are the opportunities to work collaboratively with the host railroads, the freight rail network, and where's that things and goods need to move to. And really reach out to communities and understand what are the regional nuances, where are the regional corridors that people talk about, how is it that the personal anecdotes about limitations about transportation in a region, where are the opportunities or where are the things that simply are not happening, the connections that are not happening because there are simply no connections to be had, and learning from them. And really building up about our integrated rail network or integrated network approach. It's not just passenger rail, again, as a be-all, end-all, not just as it in its own little silo, but seen as part of an integrated network. And if Rick Harnish is here, I don't know if he's here this morning, but maybe later on he'll bring that up as a really good, powerful, that the only way that each of these individual services will truly be successful is if they're part of full integrated network approach, and that includes long-distance rail, high-speed rail, aviations, highways, you name it. And prompts. This is where I want to be able to get more of audience participation. How is it that people think about travel in the region? What are unique case studies or unique examples like we heard going to medical appointments or going to the Veterans Hospital? Where are certain things that people think about travel in our region, and how is it especially people out here in the West conceptualize about travel in a region? Like the whole saying is, why fly when it's only a 14-hour drive? That is 14-hour drive maybe if the roads are good and you can be able to get there, but what happens if you can't get there? And various aspects like that. So I don't know if, Randy, if you can come up here and give me a hand. So I'm opening up to the floor. What are key aspects that people think about with travel in our region, and how is it that these regional hubs, such as cities like Billings, Boise, and so on, act as regional and greater regional hubs? So,
Excuse me, assuming we do get the Pioneer reestablished. Assuming we get the Pioneer reestablished and the North Coast Hiawatha, there's a number of connections between those that I think need to be made. One, really obvious one is Pocatello to Butte through Idaho Falls, which also would provide service to West Yellowstone as an excursion. That might be a right-of-way segment that needs to be looked at. The rail currently goes to Ashton, but it doesn't go beyond anymore. Another one that would be really key for the Treasure Valley would be a north-south route. I was recently at the University of Idaho with my granddaughter. She was in a summer program up there and wandering around the halls and found a section that was all about the student special that used to serve the University of Idaho, and how all of the many of the students from the Treasure Valley got up there on the train. That corridor still exists. Much of the track is in really awful shape, but it hasn't been abandoned. So to me, that would be a really key one, and it could go on then to Spokane. And we've long rued the fact that in Idaho it's really hard to get north and south. So for Idaho, I think those are probably the two key ones. But there's probably lots of others. And then, of course, on the Pioneer, there's lots of short segments that serve various regional markets within that should have more frequent service than just daily.
absolutely, thank you for that. And it really started trying to foot stomp that is that the value with these quote-unquote long-distance routes, again, isn't the endpoint to endpoint, as we heard. It's for the dozens of communities in between those overlapping city pairs. But especially the nuances you recognize with the north-south connectivity and how of a challenge that can be for people is recognizing what are these anecdotes and how can that inform us for the future, and how does that inform us what are the key data points we should try to quantify if we even can't quantify it right now, but to know how to chase down that lead. And especially with universities, all throughout our travels here on our train trek this last 2 weeks, that we've heard from dozens of communities and dozens of people there for students to be able to get to and from university, or for parents to be able to get to and from games and different aspects like that. How do we really facilitate that? Where is it that people are going to? And what are unique case studies, such as university towns, that have a greater draw than their domestic population might imply to the typical algorithm? Other people.
Thanks, Dan. So one thing that maybe goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, is that there is a whole other country to the north of us here in the United States. And the province to the north of us, at least a portion of north of us here in Montana, is Alberta, and is 4 times the population of the state of Montana. Just thinking about scale. So I would love to hear from other folks on this and from the room in general, but I know the Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority at an aspirational level has thought about, if we're thinking in terms of north-south connectivity, which the map that Dan showed was pretty stark in terms of lack of north-south connectivity in the western United States, what would it look like to add true connectivity not only within the western United States, perhaps from El Paso north all the way along the Front Range up here to Montana, but even farther into Alberta and Calgary. So if we're talking aspirational, big vision, connectivity, this might be something worth having on the table.
Absolutely. And speaking about our dear friends in the north,
So you heard from me yesterday from Calgary, Alberta Regional Rail. So to get here, I had effectively two options. One was to fly, the other one was to drive. To fly would be through Denver, and it would have taken me over 8 hours to fly. And I have to get to Calgary Airport 2 hours before the plane departs. The plane, I think, was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and I wouldn't have got here until 9. The plane would have landed in Billings until 9. So it's actually more efficient for me to actually drive. But the entire route, I follow a railway line. There's a railway line that goes from Calgary through Lethbridge down to the Coots border. There's a railway line through the Coots border, and it goes on to Shelby. And then in Shelby, it carries on going to Great Falls, and I go through Shelby, and I drove through Great Falls. And then from Great Falls, there's a spur line that goes down to Billings. And it's just a case of, I can drive at 130 kilometers an hour, or if the railroad was enhanced, I could catch a train that would travel at 160, maybe 200 kilometers an hour. An 8-hour drive could just be an easy overnight sleeper. I could have dinner in Calgary, overnight sleeper, and wake up in Billings. And it would have been so much more refreshing instead of stressful driving, trying to overtake big rigs on the highway. It's just, yeah, it's a nightmare drive, and just to catch a train would be so much easier. Because the flight connections are, although they say they're good, they're terrible.
Absolutely, and hopefully if anyone other flew that route recently, and I was looking at trying to fly up to Penware last month on it, and the aviation tickets when I was looking at it months ago were still quite high. So if anyone flew, hopefully that you're able to find better deals than I was at that time, but it was more expensive than spending the time and gas money to get up there. So, any other key considerations, or especially with the cross-border concept that people in commerce readily travel over state and political boundaries, even international boundaries, but there has not always been a good frame of reference or good planning methodology to recognize the nuances with it, that everyone's are stuck in their own state silos, their state DOTs are just looking predominantly just inside the state borders, but what is the cross travel and how do we recognize the nuances and really galvanize that to see projects through and do them well executed and cost effectively?
So I've looked at the line back when I was still at BNSF, so a long time ago, looked at the line for what you would call twinning, what we would call multi-tracking or double tracking into Canada, and it is difficult, and I think it would be a little bit difficult, but not impossible, to add passenger rail for a couple of reasons. One is that you have to get a presidential permit to add anything that connects into Canada. And that is a pretty onerous process. So it's something to think about. The other thing is that you have to think about customs. So when any freight train changes from being in Canada to crossing the border, it has to go through customs. That takes a significant amount of time. And you have to build significant infrastructure if you have a second track. Then in addition, if you have people, I actually got to cross into Canada on the business cars for BNSF. Everybody gets to stop, and you have to figure out how to go through customs as individuals. So you have to show your passport and figure out how to do that. So again, not an impossibility by any stretch of the imagination, but there are some wrinkles that you don't see when you're crossing state to state. And it would require some significant infrastructure from Department of Homeland Security, obviously the freight railroads, and then possibly the Canadian government as well.
Definitely, and building on that to try to take that there are certain key obstacles, I guess, kind of be able to build that connection, but they are not insurmountable even if they are significant, let's put it that way. So I guess a prompt I would put up to everyone here right now is that thinking about the opportunities we have from the IIJA, the bipartisan infrastructure language, try to think about these obstacles as opportunities there to really catalyze and move forward instead of just sort of trudging along with what we have. Let's have a vision and build toward it, but in a coherent way. So if you were given the prompt, like your duty is to be able to build this connection, how would you try to build this connection in the best way possible, in the most successful way possible, both for the passenger rail operations and for the people as well? Okay, and building onto the regional focus or building up the various aspects simultaneously and recognizing the part-whole relationship. Well, we'll have one more question quick.
Thank you. I have a comment, and it builds on what you said about networks and connectivity. Is we, as advocates, we often are advocating for an individual rail line or service, whereas with aviation and highways, there is actual national planning. And if the federal government isn't planning it, then it's mandating that states plan and that they actually cooperate with one another, whereas we don't see that with rail to the same extent. I think IIJA may help that a little bit, but an issue that we have to contend with rail planning is the arbitrary 750 mile an hour or 750 mile break, where states, if you are looking at a route that's more than 750 miles, well, now it's a national issue. But if it's less than 750 miles, then now it's a state issue, but the only state I can think of in the lower 48 that may be 750 miles is Texas, from El Paso to Beaumont. And I don't even know if that 750 miles is close, but Montana's not 750 miles across. It's a lot of miles, but it's not 750 miles. So pretty much any corridor is going to involve other states. So, and I think someone mentioned it in the last few minutes that DOTs are often siloed, and the state of Washington and the states of Oregon have been very good about planning, but I think that's somewhat unique in the United States, that there's been an intention to plan on a regional scale, not just intrastate, but interstate. So I think those are some challenges that people interested in rail planning have, and hopefully we can overcome.
Absolutely, and that is a key point, is recognizing with the whole planning on it and what can we do to facilitate it. And that's why kind of bringing it full scale. I couldn't actually find it to put in the slides today, but when you look at the 1956 U.S. Interstate Highway proposal, they didn't say, oh, this is phase one, this is phase two, or whatever there. Otherwise, people on later phases are like, well, why are we going to stick our necks out for your stuff if there's no active reciprocal engagement and being able to facilitate over state lines? But as we heard from the FRA yesterday, with the approach they're going to take both to the corridor identification program and to section 222.14, this might be an opportunity to at least start building those conversations, to start building up the opportunities for these interstate rail compacts that can not only study stuff, but actually carry stuff forward. So building from the state level to the part-to-whole relationship for the state level, I'll turn it over to Mike to describe his work in the great state of Utah.
Thanks, Dan. I have to relate a personal story that Elaine's comment actually reminded me of. I grew up in Idaho in a little town named Malad that is right north of the Utah border. It's the home of the Utah Lottery because we have the number 1, number 2, and number 4 stores in lottery ticket sales in Idaho because everyone comes from Utah to buy lottery tickets. But I graduated from high school in 1995, and the first of our classmates to pass away was actually killed a few years after we graduated. She was a student at the University of Idaho, and she was killed in a car crash commuting up to school. So yeah, I'd almost forgotten about that until Elaine mentioned the University of Idaho, and so yeah, that's definitely something that we want to keep in mind, that this is something that can save a lot of lives too. I have been working for almost a decade now on how we can expand passenger rail across Utah and meet our growing and ever-changing population demand. On this map, the thin blue line is the existing California Zephyr route that goes from Chicago to San Francisco. The gold highlighted section between Ogden and Provo is where we have our front-runner commuter rail system. And one of the problems in Utah is, like many other states, our state DOT is extremely siloed and does not really do much in terms of statewide public transit. And because of that, we have no one advocating for, or at least no one in the government at the state level advocating for statewide transit. And I looked at what we can do in Utah in terms of expanding passenger rail using existing routes. All of the red lines are existing Union Pacific routes that we could be running passenger service on. And we have significant growing population in the north in Logan and also in the south in St. George. We also have Moab over on the east that is one of our huge tourist draws. And to highlight how things have changed and why we need to not just look at routes that existed in the past, but look at what our future demographics are going to be. We have a blue line that goes between Cedar City and St. George. That would have to be a bus connection, at least to start, because St. George has never had a passenger train go to it because St. George has never had a rail line. And because prior to the 1960s and 70s, St. George was a very tiny farming town, and its population has now boomed to the county population is about to hit 200,000. And so yes, we need to definitely look at how our demographics are changing and be able to adapt to that.
Thanks, Mike. And to be able to really underscore that point, I believe it was the first half of last year that there was a study about the top housing markets in the United States, and a lot of them in the top 10 were in the greater Northwest region. Billings, actually, I forget, was like number 3 or 4 in there. Logan, Utah was on there, Rapid City, South Dakota, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and so on, that a lot of them were in the greater Northwest region. So if we want to be able to be more proactive rather than reactive in more expensive projects in the future, let's try to look out and vision for the future and build towards it coherently. Next one, of course, is the FRA regional rail planning that the FRA talked about yesterday, and about really looking at the network effect there for high performance rail and where are the needed connections, and be able to understand with the needed connections, where are the commerce and how is it that people conceptualize about travel in the region, and how do they facilitate it into an integrated network approach. And also, Mark Quam is leading the other panel session right now, but really with Scott on here, if you're still on here, if you want to describe your work with Eau Claire and the work of, the part-to-whole relationship connecting to the Twin Cities, connecting down to Milwaukee and so on.
Sure, be glad to do that, Dan. And I will mention that I actually have a presentation at the last, I think it's almost the last session today at 3 o'clock, where I'll go into more detail for what we're doing in Wisconsin to try to build the kind of support to move forward and things that we've done over the last few years. I have sort of a special place in my heart for Montana because my first ever Amtrak ride overnight was in the summer of 1971 on the restored tri-weekly, what was essentially the old North Coast Limited. And since then have taken trains to Red Lodge and Butte before it was discontinued because I have a family in Montana. Really agree with everything that's been said so far. I think Dan, you're focused on understanding travel needs and how people want to get places. We found when we talk about trains, that really resonates with people to say, okay, how would I use it? How would my family use it? What would I do to, say, send my daughter to college or something like that? And I think one of the things we focused on that I think is worth thinking about, Mike mentioned changing demographics. And, we've seen a resurgence of small cities in many parts of the country. They need transportation. They often aren't served by air service. And in our community, we've had downtown revitalization that's been very effective and more walkable places, and they lend themselves to having passenger train stops. And we even think about, you mentioned St. George, Utah, Colorado. I have family, a son who's moved to Colorado Springs, Colorado, and in that case, in the 50s, that city was 60,000 people, and now it's approaching 500,000. So a few other comments, just quickly, the win-win relationships with the host railroads are going to be essential. And also to be thinking about the funding challenges that's already been brought up with the challenges with the 750 miles and the federal versus state funding, looking at creativity there and a concept that's really being pioneered in a lot of ways by Brightline because they already own the property, but the whole idea of the economic activity that happens around train stations and looking at what's called value capture concepts, where you look at the increase in value or the economic activity how that can be deployed to help fund services. And those are all the kinds of things we're looking at, and even at non-Amtrak operators. We have a legacy line here where, because the Chicago Northwestern wanted out of the passenger service much earlier than other railroads, we haven't had passenger service since 1963, although we're heartened to see places like Maine and Vermont getting trains back that were not even operating at the time Amtrak started. So I know our time is short. I'll talk more about what we're doing specifically to build support at our session this afternoon. Would be glad to respond to anything else.
Great, thank you. Could we get the slides, please? And then really building up to with Washington, all aboard Washington, recognizing what the travel needs throughout there and the east-west connectivity, and how does that overlap with the other potential services as well, most namely the North Coast Hiawatha that will connect directly to Billings here. And then looking at the national perspective from national organizations, what are the connections that they're really envisioning, really trying to build up to a full national network there that facilitates people traveling where they want to go, when they want to go, rather than being an arduous choice. And what is the concept? Like I wanted to ask the question at the end, where is a distance that is too great that it becomes a conceptual leap if you can drive to just end up driving rather than being a throughway connection of some sort of transportation option? And then to our friends with the High-Speed Rail Alliance here, which we'll hopefully be able to hear from Rick more this afternoon about their integrated network approach and building up not high-speed rail as the be-all, end-all, but as the backbone that you connect all these other services. And what I admire about his presentations, he's clear to articulate that high-speed rail will not be successful in the U.S. or North America if it's not backed up by the conventional intercity passenger rail backbone and transportation networks. That this is just one idea, one concept, one iteration that our coalition and All Aboard Northwest have gotten to after talking with communities, talking with our regional coalition stakeholders about where the travel needs, where are the travel corridors, and where's the existing infrastructure that we can work cooperatively with the host railroads for improvements there, economic development, and opportunities. Looking on the map, you see all the yellow lines are existing Amtrak services, such as the Empire Builder to the north along the High Line, California Zephyr to the south, and that all the blue are new blue connections to be able to facilitate long-distance intercity passenger rail service. Where are the major population centers? Where is it that people think about travel if you're traveling like in your personal car to be able to go from one area to another area, and how can you be able to facilitate that? And the idea of working on these multiple aspects simultaneously, that these connections can be long-distance rail, commuter rail, state-supported rail, and a whole combination of them, like Elaine was saying about being able to build up more localized service on top of the base backbone. And just really, it's one concept, one idea. It's not the be-all, end-all, but just trying to build up the regional perspective and get the political buy-in for people. Since too many times I found a lot of people are very interested in these things, but they're in a, quote, a wait-and-see mentality. They've been waiting for the Pioneer North Coast routes to get off the ground, but if we keep doing things in a segmentized, clunky method there, it's not able to be a reciprocal engagement. It seems very disingenuous to some of these communities that have been off the map for decades. It's like, oh yeah, wink wink after the fact, maybe you can get service later on down the road, limited terms and conditions apply. And that, again, our vision is more than lines on a map that some people would try to decry it as, but it's really providing seamless door-to-door connectivity to everyone in the region, offering economic, environmental, and equity benefits for people and communities all throughout the region, and really connecting these localized and regionalized economic hubs in a coherent way. Like as I described, coming from a very rural area, where is it that you go to for your large shopping trips? Are you going to Costco, or are you going for major medical appointments? If you're able to connect these major population centers and the communities on the way to them in a coherent way, that provides access to people across the region. And really developing that equity, that geographic equity. And just sort of building the long-term momentum to put a concept out there, it might be these quote-unquote far-fetched ideas, these far-fetched connections, the ones that are harder to work with, that actually might be the catalyst to galvanize the political support to be able to see the network we all need and realize the Pioneer North Coast routes. Since Washington State has 2 U.S. senators, Wyoming has 2 U.S. senators, Wisconsin has 2 U.S. senators, and so on. So how do we build enough of a case so people in these communities all across the states feel buy-in and that they feel they have a stake in there to really nudge their U.S. Congress people and senators to support and robustly support passenger rail planning for the long term. Again, 3 takeaways is a need for a holistic vision and to be able to work and build towards it. And working on multiple aspects simultaneously but coherently, you're able to work on long-distance passenger rail, localized state-supported rail, commuter rail, and so on, and that we're able to elevate the cost to do all these various constituent projects from a low simmer to a rolling boil. It's able to go from a good project, but let's make do with a less than ideal situation that's a detriment not only to passenger operations, but potentially even to the whole freight railroad operations too. So let's take care of it now and move on. And really give a nod to your neighbors to build the long-term sustainable political and economic case. Not asking you to go out of your way or bend over backwards or do free work for them, but as you're talking about your vision, recognize the part-to-whole relationship and how is it that your part builds up to the greater overall whole, and give a nudge to your neighbors to be like that they also deserve connections as well, and look at what they're doing over there. Similar as we were talking to our counterparts all across the nation, such as the Gulf Coast, Virginia, New England there with Burlington, Vermont, finally getting service for the first time in 69 years. And be able to recognize the wins that way and how that builds up the case for the full national system we need. Again, the full regional national network and how do we build it up there. So I'll open up to Scott or Mike if you want to have any last closing comments.
I think I'm good.
Scott, do you have anything to add online?
No, I think you're right on track, and no, well, pun intended, I guess. And I think these are all important issues to think about. I think one of the things a point you made was you really do need a critical mass. You need to make this convenient for people and have a vision instead of just single lines.
Thank you. So, thank you all for your time today. Open up to questions, comments, or especially with the regional nuances there. We brought up how is it that people think about travel in our region, and where can we find key win-win opportunities, especially with the Holst railroads, their collaboration, or where the needs for shippers, as was brought up during one of the panels earlier.
I think one of the issues is, one of the deceptions about maps is that it doesn't talk about, at the national scale, I could see Boise being connected to Salt Lake or anywhere else, but it doesn't necessarily mean something to me if I live in Boise to see that connection. I need to know how am I getting from my house to the rail station. And what's unique about rail is that it provides a high intensity use to a specific location. It doesn't distribute it very well at the end. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know how you have this conversation without having at the same time a development conversation about we can't just talk about the lines, you also have to talk about what's being developed at and around those stations. Which leads me to my next point, which is, I don't know what the right approach is, but there's been a couple of comments about the Empire Builder and how inconvenient it is for those smaller connections, those in-between connections, which has been highlighted a couple of times as the in-between connections are just as important as the endpoints. Mm-hmm. But one of the problems with long-distance rail is, in some ways, the tail wags the dog. You depart Chicago at a certain time, but that means you're getting to Cut Bank and to Coeur d'Alene at different times that are completely inconvenient for any sort of regional travel. Mm-hmm. And so I just wonder if the regional, and rather than thinking of it so much as a national organization, if you thought about it in terms of regional nodes leading the way as opposed to the long connections leading the way, because the other thing that lines don't show is they don't show when service goes. And we talk about capacity of rail, which is great, but people don't ride things because there's capacity. People ride things because it makes the connection convenient. So you need to have service that runs more than twice a day. You need to have service that runs at the times that you need it to be. And so I don't know how you have a train show up at all the places between Chicago and Seattle at a reasonable time without there being either lots of them or it broken up into smaller segments. And so I don't know the right approach necessarily, but you have to be thinking the strength of rail is the density of travel that you have along it and the possibility of intensifying development along that. And so we can't, in my view, you can't divorce the conversation about development from this particular travel mode because it's not as fast as planes, but there are unique values that rail brings that plane travel does not.
Absolutely, and that's one thing that we've been seeing elsewhere as we've been talking to communities is the ability to have a station stop downtown and really foster that community and economic development. And I don't know if there's I'll let other people chime in here, but if there's a one-size-fits-all mentality that we should work on both aspects simultaneously.
Yeah. Dan, you mentioned simultaneous a couple of times, and leading into what was just said here, I think there's a lot to be said for developing the regional service simultaneously with this long-distance service. Ron Pate and I have had several discussions about establishing service over the Stampede Pass route between Seattle and Spokane, which would be less than 750 miles state-supported, but it would be daytime service that would be convenient to some of these smaller communities, because even if we restore the North Coast Hiawatha, it could come through in the middle of the night. So the value of that to college kids trying to get to the numerous communities in these cities across Washington and whatnot is limited. So I'd like to see us at least start thinking about these regional routes, and that could be done by at least an expression of interest to the FRA in accordance with their current request. And I'm sure there's others other than the Stampede Pass route. Elaine, I'm sure there's some down in your area that are regional in nature, and in Utah that are regional in nature. And I think we need to think about these simultaneously with the long-distance service.
Absolutely, thank you. And looking at the time here, we'll have time only for maybe one more question or so.
I think we're done. We need to go on break.
Okay. Any last question? Okay. Well, otherwise, please talk to us afterwards, but really try to think on how do we have a holistic vision and build the political and economic traction to see it through. So thank you all for your time today. I really appreciate speaking with you, and I'll be a moderator in a panel this afternoon.